The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Eric, I remember that one of the first times I heard you on Tom Wood's show, you were going over all of these regulations that the car companies have to deal with for things like, gas mileage, as an
Practically
example.
everything.
Yeah, but everything. But it's so ironic because you were stating that if the government just got out of the way, the cars that we drive today would get far better gas mileage.
Sure.
And
we'd also have a great deal more choice in the variety of cars that would be available to us.
Yeah. So can you expand on just some of these regulations that most people have no idea the car companies have to abide by that limit our choice, increase prices, and ironically reduce gas mileage?
Well, yeah, sure. The first one, of course, is the mandatory minimum mile per gallon requirements, which are known by the bureaucratic acronym CAFE, which stands for Corporate Average Fuel Economy. And what that means is that every car company has to achieve a certain fleet average mileage. And if they don't, they get dunned with gas guzzler taxes, which of course they pass on to us, the car buyer. Now, the curious thing about it is the government says that it has to do this because if it didn't do that, the evil car industry would not build high efficiency cars. And I got to thinking about that many years ago and thought to myself, well, if there's demand for it, why wouldn't the car companies build it? Wouldn't they make money selling what people want to buy? And the fact of the matter is that before these gas mileage mandates existed, which takes us back to roughly about 1976, 77, there was a plethora of highly fuel efficient cars. You could go out and buy a little Volkswagen Beetle. You could buy all sorts of cars that emphasized mileage. You had that choice if you wanted that particular attribute. Of course, there were also gigantic Cadillacs and Buicks and everything in between. So people were free to choose. The problem is the government doesn't like that. The government wants one size fits all. So it posits these mile per gallon mandates that effectively force cars to have all of these things that will improve gas mileage, which of course we end up paying for. And here's where it gets really twisted and weird and bizarre. There are conflicting federal requirements, the safety requirements that have made cars significantly heavier than they used to be, which works contrary to the whole object of getting high gas mileage, because the heavier a car is, the bigger an engine it needs to propel it down the road. And so it ends up using more gas. So that's why today, here we are in 2021, and I think the most fuel efficient non-hybrid car on the market right now gets about 41 miles per gallon on the highway. If you went back to 1980, which is 40 years ago, you could find a car without a computer, with a carburetor, with a manual transmission, very basic little car that not only got at least that much, but sometimes got more without all of this technological rigmarole. And that's because that car weighed on average 800 to 1,000 pounds less than its latter-day modern equivalent. So, government takes away choices from us. It imposes costs on us, and then it tries to convince us that it's doing us a favor. It's kind of like the guy who breaks your leg and then hands you a crutch and says, "Thank you very much. And by the way, here's a bill for $300 for the crutch."
Yeah, like Jim Grant says, the arsonist and the firefighter.
Right.
What's funny is my very first car that my dad let me drive around was a diesel Volkswagen Rabbit.
Yep.
Remember those? I think it was a 1980 or 81. And you want to talk about a libertarian. My father was never political at all. But to give you a quick glimpse of how he led his life and how he raised me, I was born in 1973. So in the mid 80s there, when I was around driving age.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in Oregon, the legal driving age was 16 years old. Mm-hmm. And you could get your permit at, I think, 15, something like that. But even before then, even before I had my permit, so like the latter stages of when I was 14 years old, my father used to not only allow me to drive the car to school by myself, mind you, no license, no permit. And, he said, just don't tell your mother.
You know what? Oh, I had the same experience. We're roughly the same age. I'm a couple of years older than you, but our GenX group, we experienced that. And I think that was the last cohort of Americans that lived that. And I don't think it's coincidental that we're suffering from a real chronic condition of of control and coercion today because people have grown up with it and so are used to it. These millennials, I really feel bad for them because from the moment of their first awareness, they are just told, sit here, don't do anything, do what you're told, regulated, micromanaged. These kids, they don't get to get their learner's permit when they're 15 and change. Certainly most of them don't get behind the wheel of a car when they're 14, like you and I did. They're strapped like little Hannibal Lecters into their safety seats. And no wonder they're terrified of everything and standing there waiting to be told what to do by authority.
Yeah.
It's sad. It's really a sad thing.
Let's go over, we've discussed kind of how they defeat their own purposes by making cars heavier and then with the gas mileage. But what else do they do that the normal person would never ever think about, to where they're creating higher prices for consumers at all times?
Well, we're reaching a point of technological desperation with regard to what is possible from an engineering point of view, with regard to achieving compliance with these increasingly batty mandates. For example, they are talking about pushing the mandatory minimum mileage that all cars, not just a few, but all cars will have to reach by, I think it's 2026, and it's close to 50 miles per gallon. Now, there's just no way you can do that technically without resorting to some pretty extreme things. One of the extreme things is, for example, I have a new Subaru Ascent, which I'm test driving this week. They send me new cars to drive each week. And this is an 8-passenger crossover SUV, 3 rows, big. And under the hood, it has a 2.4-liter 4-cylinder engine. Now, in the past, you would always have had at least a V6 in a vehicle that size because of the size of the vehicle. You need a bigger engine.
Right.
Well, in order to squeeze a little bit more gas mileage out of it and to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, they resort to these tiny, tiny little engines, and then they compensate for the lack of displacement and the lack of power by heavily turbocharging them, so that when you push on the gas, yeah, you got your power, but you've added this enormous complexity and physical pressure. That's what turbocharging does. It physically pressurizes the engine, so it places that much more strain on all the internal parts, the bearings, connecting rods, everything, which almost inevitably is going to decrease the longevity of the power plant. So rather than something that would probably run relatively trouble-free for 150, 170,000 miles, now you got this thing that's probably going to need a new turbo by the time it reaches 100,000 miles, and probably will be burning oil and need to be replaced by the time it reaches 170,000 miles.
Yeah.
And for what? Because it gets 3 miles per gallon better than the V6 would have gotten. And that's not an exaggeration. The difference in mileage is that small on an individual car basis. But when you do the CAFE math and you factor it out across hundreds of thousands of vehicles, which is what the car companies have to do to comply with the regulations, these incremental little differences matter a great deal.
Yeah, that's a great point. And not only do you have to fix them sooner, but the cost of fixing them when they go wrong is just unbelievably higher. You know, I was with a good buddy of mine who's a car guy. He's actually been a car dealer. He buys and sells them on eBay. He's done that since we were in college. Not on eBay, but he's bought and sold cars since we got out of college. And we were in a shop, this was a few years ago, and the guy, the mechanic, was working on one of these new King Ranch Fords. And I can't recall if it was the 6.7 Power Stroke, the diesel, or if it's I can't remember which one it was. But he just had the whole entire thing apart. And we're like, my goodness, what are you doing to this thing? And it was something like changing the spark plugs. I don't know if it was that exactly, but it was something just very, very small. And we're like, my goodness, how many hours do you have to bill to do that job? And he's like, oh, probably 10 or 12 hours. And I'm like, at $80?
Sure. And you know that diesel engine option too, typically in a truck like that, will cost you about $10,000, all else being equal, above what you paid for the vehicle. And these diesels, which used to sell chiefly on their simplicity relative to a gas engine, their ease of maintenance relative to a gas engine, and their longevity relative to a gas engine, well, that's all out the window. They're not mechanically injected anymore. Mechanical injection is really simple. They're now electronically injected, just like a gas engine. And they have all of these Rube Goldberg-esque things that are affixed to them, particulate traps, DEF, that have made them incredibly expensive, that have made them only fractionally, a little bit more than that, but not significantly more fuel efficient than A gas engine, not as long-lived, more maintenance intensive. And here comes the kicker. The diesel fuel now is more expensive than gas. And you can remember diesel used to be less expensive than gas. Now it's about 40 cents a gallon higher. So why would you even bother with the diesel engine? Really, the only thing that makes sense, the only rationale for buying it is if you need to pull a really heavy load behind a big truck. That's pretty much the only rational reason to get a diesel anymore. It's nice to have the blur, 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 and the sound and all of that. But from a functional point of view, there's not much justification for it anymore. And you can thank the government for that.
Yeah, but then if that were the case, I'd just get like a 2001 7.3 Power Stroke. Remember the 7.3 made by International? Because I don't know if you know this, Eric, but I talk about it occasionally on my channel, that back a few years ago, I was helping out my younger brother in Tucson and I got bored. So it just, through a random sequence of events, I started flipping trucks. And I got super focused on the 95 to 2002 Fords, the F-250 and 350, because of that Power Stroke motor.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that if I could find them in a no rust state with under 100,000 miles and put them on eBay, you'd like double your money almost every single time, because they were in such high demand. But they were to your point, they were the opposite. I mean, you had this huge engine bay that you could sleep in the engine bay. You could get to any of the parts. I mean, the injectors are kind of hard to change, but you could get, it was just almost toward the point where you could do it yourself. And that's not talking about the 460 7.5 liters. Those got about 3 miles to the gallon. But the good thing is, I mean, anybody could change almost any part on that entire engine in about an hour.
Absolutely. And I think also that that's one of the reasons, one of the compounding reasons why so many kids today aren't interested in cars. They're unapproachable. They're so technically complex. They require expensive diagnostic tools. When you're 15, 16 years old, you can't afford that stuff. Right. When you and I were that age, you could go out and buy a basic socket set for $20. And because they were largely mechanical devices, you could get your hands on it and you could look at it and you could kind of figure out, well, okay, if I do this, if I turn that, it has this effect. But with electronically controlled components, it's a lot more sophisticated. You have to have a lot more specialized knowledge. It's very daunting, I think, for a novice, for somebody who's just trying to learn as they go, to figure it out. And of course, the cost is forbidding. If you're 15, 16 years old, you can't come up with $500 for a specialized tool to work on your vehicle. That's ridiculous.